What if the gods were not metaphor, but memory? What if the stories carved into clay tablets beneath the desert sands speak not of imagination, but of presence? There are names that have traveled through 5,000 years, syllables pressed into wet earth by hands that trembled with reverence, or perhaps recognition. The Anunnaki, those who came from heaven to earth. They ruled Mesopotamia's night sky and morning prayers, yet their story refuses the boundaries of myth. It begins with clay, soft and yielding under reed stylus, baked hard by fire or sun, or the simple passage of millennia. The tablets sit in museums now, behind glass, numbered and catalogued. Yet when one stands before them, there is a quality to the script that feels less like storytelling and more like testimony. The cuneiform does not sing of distant abstractions. It names them. It gives them genealogies, assigns them cities, records their arguments and their feasts. Perhaps what unsettles us about the Anunnaki is not their strangeness, but their familiarity. The word itself carries weight. An, the Sumerian term for heaven or sky. Ki, meaning earth. Anunnaki, then, are those who bridge the two. In the oldest texts, the name refers to a collective, the great gods who assembled in council to determine the fates of both heaven and earth itself. They were not omnipotent in the way later theology would imagine divinity. They grew tired, they argued, they made decisions that later required correction. The tablets described them with a specificity that mythology rarely permits, as though the scribes were recording not legend, but bureaucracy, the administration of a world shared between the divine and the newly made. When the first archaeologists uncovered the libraries of Nineveh and Ur in the 19th century, they found thousands of tablets describing creation, flood, the ordering of cosmos and humanity. These were not the poetic vagueness of origin myths told around fires. They were detailed, technical, listing generations of gods the way one might list kings. They described the mixing of clay and divine blood to create the first humans. They recorded the rebellion of worker gods and the solution crafted to relieve them. They spoke of humans not as blessed creations, but as necessary inventions, beings made to serve. It is strange how familiar that sounds. The Sumerians appeared in southern Mesopotamia around 4,000 years before the Common Era, or perhaps earlier. The dating shifts with each excavation, each new reading of astronomical references in the texts. They arrived in a land of marshes and rivers, and within centuries they had built cities, invented writing, codified law, mapped the heavens with precision that would not be matched for millennia. Archaeologists call this the sudden emergence of civilization. The tablets themselves suggest something different. They suggest remembering. For the Anunnaki are not described as distant creators who spoke the world into being and departed. They walked among humans. They taught agriculture, metallurgy, mathematics, astronomy. They established temples not as symbolic structures, but as literal residences, places where the gods dwelt and required daily sustenance. Bread and beer were offered not as spiritual gesture, but as provision, as though divinity itself could hunger. Perhaps the most unsettling detail is the consistency. The same names appear across thousands of years. Anu, father of the gods, distant king of heaven. Enlil, lord of the air and earth, administrator of divine decree. Enki, lord of the waters and wisdom, creator and teacher. Ninhursag, mother goddess who shaped life from clay. Inanna, later called Ishtar, goddess of love and war, who walked the earth and descended into the underworld. These are not vague personifications of natural forces. They are personalities, rendered with individual motivations, conflicts, desires. The tablets record their meetings, the decisions made in council, the dissent among them. When Enlil grew weary of humanity's noise and proposed the flood, Enki wept and conspired to save them. When the worker gods rebelled against their labor, the Anunnaki deliberated on a solution and chose creation over continued oppression. When Inanna coveted the divine decrees held by Enki, she traveled to his city, made him drunk, and stole them. These are not the actions of symbols, they are the actions of beings, whether divine or otherwise, navigating existence with agency and imperfection. And yet for all their presence in the texts, they remain elusive. Were they gods in the sense that later religions would define divinity? Were they something else entirely, beings of flesh who possessed knowledge that seemed divine to those who received it? The tablets do not answer this. They simply record. And in that recording lies the tension that has made the Anunnaki endure long past the civilization that first carved their names. Every few centuries, humanity rediscovers them and asks the same questions. In the 19th century, scholars decoded cuneiform and found flood narratives that predated the Bible. In the 20th century, alternative researchers proposed extraterrestrial origins, reading the tablets as documentation of ancient contact. In the 21st century, academics and enthusiasts alike continued to pass the clay, seeking in its lines either confirmation of myth or evidence of memory compressed by time into something that resembles both. Perhaps that is why the story persists. The Anunnaki occupy a threshold between what we call mythology and what we call history. Their accounts possess a quality that resists easy categorization, too detailed to dismiss as pure invention, too impossible to accept as literal record, too consistent across millennia to be coincidence, too fragmented to be complete. What if the question itself is the answer? What if the Anunnaki endure not because they were real or unreal, but because they represent something humanity has never stopped asking? Where did we come from? Who taught us to build and measure and wonder? And are we alone in having wondered? The tablets offer no definitive response. They sit in their climate-controlled cases, silent witnesses to their own persistence. The clay does not defend itself against interpretation. It simply exists, patient as the earth from which it came, carrying names that once commanded sacrifice and now command attention. Anu, Enlil, Enki. The syllables feel strange in modern mouths, yet they were once as familiar as breath, spoken in morning ritual and evening prayer, carved into contracts and pressed into seals, invoked to bind oaths and bless foundations. They ruled the space between earth and heaven, the texts tell us. They made humanity and regretted it and saved it and abandoned it. They taught and they punished and they departed, slowly over centuries, until only their names remained. Or perhaps they never departed at all. Perhaps what we call the gods becoming myth is simply consciousness, changing its relationship to the numinous, the way children eventually stop seeing magic in what once seemed miraculous and start calling it pattern, calling it nature, calling it law. The Anunnaki may have been no more or less present in ancient Sumer than they are now. What changed was not their existence, but our perception, our willingness to name presence as divine. The question hovers in the space between the cuneiform lines. Who were they? What did they represent? Why did the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians carry these names forward through conquest and collapse, through languages that died and empires that crumbled, preserving the genealogies and the stories even as the belief that animated them faded into scholarly interest? Maybe because the story the tablets tell is not only about gods. It is about the relationship between knowledge and its keepers, between creation and creator, between service and autonomy. It is about beings who made other beings to relieve their burden, who grew attached despite themselves, who argued among themselves about the worth of what they had made. If these are gods, they are uncomfortable ones, too fallible, too present, too much like us. And in that resemblance, perhaps, lies the truth they were always trying to preserve. Not a history of where the gods went, but a memory of where we came from and what it means to carry within us the trace of something other, whether divine blood or simply the inheritance of those who taught us to press meaning into clay and trust that it would survive long enough for someone, someday, to read it and remember. So let us descend into that clay, into the languages written by Reed on wet earth, and ask not whether the Anunnaki were real, but what it means that humanity has never stopped trying to remember them. The story begins, as all ancient stories do, not with certainty but with fragments, tablets broken and scattered, a civilization that rose from nothing, or perhaps from something we have chosen to forget. The Sumerians appeared as if from nowhere, the first civilization in a land that should not have supported one. Between the Tigris and Euphrates, where water met desert and silt gathered in slow accumulation, they built cities when the rest of humanity still wandered. By the time their neighbors had learned to cultivate grain, the Sumerians had already invented writing, constructed ziggurats that pierced the sky, mapped the movements of planets invisible to the naked eye. It is as though they arrived carrying knowledge rather than discovering it, as though civilization did not evolve but remembered. The archaeological record offers no gradual emergence, no progression from simple to complex. The Sumerians appear in southern Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE, perhaps earlier, already possessing sophisticated irrigation systems, urban planning, mathematical notation, astronomical tables. Where they came from remains unclear. The tablets do not record a migration. They speak instead of a beginning, of gods who established order in the land between the rivers and set humanity to work within it. Those gods were the Anunnaki. In the earliest texts, the term functions almost bureaucratically. The Anunnaki are the assembly, the great gods who gather in council to determine fate. They are distinct from the Igigi, the younger or lesser gods assigned to labor. This hierarchy matters. It shapes the entire mythology, the entire relationship between divine and human. For the Anunnaki did not labor. They decreed, they judged, they delegated. At the apex sat Anu, whose name means heaven, father of gods, distant king who rarely descended to earth. Beneath him, Enlil, lord of the air and storm, whose temple at Nippur formed the religious center of all Sumer. Enlil held the tablet of destinies, the divine authority to determine fate. He was not a gentle god. The tablets describe him as harsh, quick to anger, intolerant of human noise and imperfection. When the great flood came, it was Enlil who commanded it. Beside Enlil stood Enki, called also Ea, lord of the subterranean waters, god of wisdom and creation. If Enlil was authority, Enki was ingenuity. The texts depict him as humanity's advocate, the one who taught rather than commanded, who valued cleverness and found solutions where Enlil saw only problems requiring elimination. It was Enki who would save humanity from the flood, working quietly against the council's decree. Then Ninhursag, the Earth Mother, Lady of the Mountain, birth goddess who shaped life from clay. Some texts call her Ninmah, meaning exalted lady. Others name her Nintu, lady who gives birth. She appears in the creation accounts as the one whose hands literally formed the first humans, who molded clay into flesh, who presided over the births that would populate the earth. Hers was the practical work of creation, the labor of bringing divine design into physical form. And there were others. Utu, the sun god, dispenser of justice. Nana, the moon, measurer of time. Inanna, who would later be known as Ishtar, goddess of love and warfare, the morning and evening star. Each had their city, their temple, their sphere of influence. Enki ruled from Eridu, the first city, where sweet water rose from the depths. Enlil governed from Nippur. Inanna held Uruk. The gods were not abstract principles dwelling in unreachable heavens. They lived in specific locations and required specific offerings. The temples were not symbolic. They were residences. Each day, priests prepared meals for the gods, dressing their statues, speaking to them, consulting them on matters of state and harvest and war. The relationship between human and divine was transactional, almost contractual. Humanity served, the gods protected. When the service pleased them, prosperity followed. When it failed, catastrophe descended. This was not faith as later religions would define it. This was relationship, formal and specified, carved into clay and sealed with divine authority. But behind this structure, beneath the bureaucracy of heaven, lay stories of how it all began. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, composed sometime in the second millennium before the Common Era, preserves a version older than its own telling. It speaks of primordial forces, Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt sea, whose mingling gave birth to the first gods. Those younger gods made too much noise. Apsu sought to destroy them. The gods discovered the plot, killed Apsu, and from his body Enki created his dwelling place. Tiamat, enraged, raised an army of monsters to avenge her consort. The younger gods trembled. None could face her until Marduk, son of Enki, stepped forward with a condition. If he defeated Tiamat, he must be granted supreme authority over all gods. He won. He split Tiamat's body like a shellfish, creating heaven from half, earth from the other. From her eyes, he made the Tigris and Euphrates flow. From her corpse, he ordered the cosmos. And in that ordering, he became king of the gods, absorbing the powers of the older Anunnaki, carrying 50 names that catalogued his supremacy. Yet this version, though Babylonian, echoes something older. The Sumerian texts speak of similar primordial waters, similar generations of gods, similar establishment of cosmic order through violence and delegation. The names change, the emphasis shifts, but the pattern remains. Creation through separation, order through hierarchy, and always, at the foundation, the Anunnaki in council, determining the shape of what would be. The Atrahasis epic, older still, preserved in fragments dating to the old Babylonian period, but surely older in conception, tells the story differently. In this account, the Anunnaki did not merely shape cosmos from chaos. They labored within it. For 40 years, the text says, or perhaps 40,000, the Igigi gods dredged rivers, dug canals, carried earth. They built the infrastructure of civilization under the direction of the Anunnaki. But gods, it seems, grow weary. The Igigi rebelled. They burned their tools, surrounded Enlil's temple, demanded relief. The Anunnaki assembled in council. What to do? The work was necessary. The cosmos required maintenance. But the Igigi refused to continue. Enki proposed a solution that would echo through every creation myth that followed. Make a replacement. Create a being capable of labor but beneath the gods. Create humanity. Here the text becomes specific in ways that mythology rarely permits. They describe the process, the materials, the method. Clay from the earth. Blood from a slain god. Wi'ilu or Geshtu'i, depending on the version. A god killed to provide divine essence. Ninhursag mixed them, molded them, created 7 males and 7 females with the help of 7 birth goddesses. The blood gave humans intelligence, the trace of divine consciousness necessary to understand commands and perform complex tasks. The clay gave them mortality, the eventual return to earth. Humanity was born not from love, but from necessity. Not blessed, but engineered. The tablets do not speak of souls breathed into dust by a gentle creator. They speak of mixture, of proportions, of gestation periods and birth goddesses who labored through the creation as though following a procedure already known. And what was humanity's purpose? The texts are clear. To bear the yoke the gods refuse, to maintain the canals, tend the fields, offer sustenance to the temples, to work so that the Anunnaki need not. The Sumerian word for human, Lulu, means mixed one, hybrid, something created from combining previously separate elements. Another term, Awilu, means worker. Perhaps this is why the tablets feel less like mythology and more like documentation. They do not dress creation in poetic vagueness. They explain it as one might explain a solution to a practical problem. The gods needed workers. They made workers. Those workers carried divine essence, but remained bound to earth, capable of thought but limited by flesh, aware of their purpose, but unable to transcend it. The Anunnaki, then, were not creators in the way later monotheism would understand the term. They were designers, engineers, administrators who solved the problem of cosmic maintenance through innovation. They did not make humanity from nothing. They made it from themselves, mixing their essence with earth, creating consciousness bound to mortality. This relationship defined everything that followed. Humans built temples because gods required dwelling places. They offered food because gods needed sustenance, or because the ritual itself maintained the covenant between creator and created. They lived under divine law because the Anunnaki, assembled in council, decreed those laws and enforced them through the mechanisms of nature, blessing and catastrophe, flood and harvest, victory and defeat. In the underworld, the Anunnaki sat as judges of the dead, 7 of them, according to some texts, determining the fate of souls who had completed their earthly labor. Even in death, humanity answered to them, standing before the council that had authorized their creation, receiving judgment on the service rendered during life. But there was more to the relationship than labor and judgment. The tablets also speak of the Me, a concept difficult to translate, usually rendered as divine decrees or divine powers or fundamental aspects of civilization. The Me were not abstract. They were almost tangible, things that could be possessed, stolen, transferred. Kingship was a Me. Writing was a Me. Warfare, music, craftsmanship, sexual love, all were Me. aspects of civilized existence that the Anunnaki controlled and occasionally granted to humanity or to individual cities. In one famous text, Inanna travels to Eridu and visits Enki in his temple. She plies him with beer. When he becomes drunk, she asks for the ME. He grants them more than 100 fundamental decrees, the essence of civilization itself. When he sobers and realizes what he has done, he tries to retrieve them. But Inanna has already fled to her city of Uruk, bringing with her the powers that would make her city great. The story reads almost like political intrigue, like the transfer of technology or knowledge from one center of power to another, with the gods as actors in a drama of cultural transmission. These were not distant, unknowable deities. They made mistakes. They got drunk. They played favorites with cities and kings. They argued among themselves about how to treat humanity, whether to preserve or destroy, whether to share knowledge or hoard it. The tablets record disagreements in council, dissent from the majority decision, individual gods working against the collective will. When Enlil decreed the flood, Enki opposed it and found a way to save at least one human family, despite his colleagues' determination to wipe the earth clean. And yet, for all their fallibility, they remained gods. They possessed knowledge humanity lacked. They understood the movement of heavens, the cycles of time, the techniques of creation and destruction. They lived outside normal time, their lifespans measured in epochs, while human generations flickered like candles. They were present at the beginning and would endure past any human ending. The Sumerians seem to accept this paradox without difficulty. Their gods were both transcendent and immediate, both divine and disturbingly familiar. Perhaps that is what we find most unsettling when we read the tablets now. We expect gods to be either wholly other or wholly metaphorical. The Anunnaki refuse both categories. They occupy the uncomfortable space between beings of power who nonetheless required help, who created servants and then formed relationships with them, who gave gifts and demanded service, who walked among humans and then, slowly, over centuries, withdrew into distance. Around the same time the Sumerians were pressing these stories into clay, other civilizations were forming their own accounts of origin and divine hierarchy, but none matched the detailed specificity of the Mesopotamian texts. The gods of Egypt remained more abstract, more cosmic. The gods of Greece, though they possessed personality, dwelt primarily in myth rather than historical accounting. The Anunnaki alone seemed to exist in both realms simultaneously, present in creation stories and king lists, in cosmic battles and city administration, in primordial time and historical record. What does it mean that the first civilization chose to record their gods this way? Not as distant creators or personified forces, but as present administrators, as beings who labored and rested, who planned and regretted, who made humanity and then had to live with what they had made. The clay offers no answer. It records. And in that recording, preserved by fire and chance through 5,000 years, the Anunnaki remain suspended between interpretation and fact, between gods we worship and beings we might recognize, between the mythology we study and the history we cannot quite dismiss. There is a moment in the Atrahasis epic when the gods grow weary. For 40 years, the text says, or perhaps 40,000. The clay is unclear about whether it measures mortal time or divine. The Igigi have labored in the rivers and marshes of southern Mesopotamia. They have dredged channels through silt, carried earth in baskets, built the infrastructure of heaven's earthly estate. They are gods, but minor ones, young enough to be assigned work, numerous enough to be expendable, and they are exhausted. The rebellion begins quietly, a whisper among the workers, a recognition that what they endure is not temporary duty, but endless servitude. They gather in the night, surrounding the dwelling of Enlil, Lord of the air and earth, administrator of the cosmic order. They burn their tools, the spades and baskets that have shaped the landscape for longer than human memory can measure, go up in flames, and the smoke carries their defiance toward heaven. Enlil wakes to find his temple surrounded by gods refusing to work. The tablets record what happens next with a detail of legal proceeding. Enlil summons the council of the great Anunnaki. Anu descends from his distant heaven. Enki rises from his waters. They assemble to hear the complaint and determine judgment. The Igigi stand firm. They will not return to labor. The work has broken them. Something must change. Enlil proposes the obvious solution. Punish the rebels. Execute their leader. Restore order through force. But Enki speaks against this. The complaint is just, he argues. The work is indeed too much. The Igigi have labored beyond reasonable measure. To destroy them solves nothing. For then who will maintain the rivers, the canals, the fields that feed the temples? The cosmos requires maintenance. The question is not whether the work will be done, but who will do it. In that question, humanity is born. Enki proposes creating a replacement worker, not a god, for gods have proven troublesome, capable of rebellion, unwilling to serve indefinitely. Something lesser, a being with enough intelligence to understand complex tasks, but without divine status, without the power to refuse. A creature that could be shaped, controlled, bound to earth and to service. A Lulu, a mixed one, something between the divine and the earthly, carrying trace enough of heaven to think, but weighted enough with clay to remain mortal. The council agrees, but the practical problem remains: how to create such a being. The tablets describe the solution with a precision that feels almost technical. 2 elements are required: clay from the earth, the physical material that will form the body, and blood from a god, the essence that will provide consciousness, intelligence, the spark of awareness necessary to comprehend instruction and perform labor. Without the clay, there is no physical form. Without the divine blood, there is only animal, incapable of the work required. A god must be sacrificed. The text names him Wei'ilu in some versions, Geshtu'i in others. He is one of the rebels, either their leader or simply one chosen from among them. The tablets do not dwell on his resistance or acceptance. They record only that he is slain, his blood collected, his essence prepared for mixing. Whether this is punishment for rebellion or voluntary sacrifice offered to end the conflict, the clay does not specify. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. What matters is the blood, the divine substance that will transform clay into something more than clay. Ninhursag receives the blood. She is the birth goddess, lady of the mountain, the one whose hands shape life. Some texts call her Ninmah, the exalted lady. Others name her Belet Eli, lady of the gods. Her role is both sacred and practical. She will mix the elements, mold the forms, oversee the births that will bring the new creatures into existence. The process unfolds like instruction. Ninhursag takes the clay, adds the blood, kneads them together. The proportions matter. Too much clay and the mixture lacks consciousness. Too much divine essence and the creation might rival the gods themselves. The balance must be precise. Enough divinity to think, enough earth to die. 14 pieces she makes, 7 male, 7 female, and to assist her, 7 birth goddesses are summoned, each to receive 1 male piece and 1 female piece, each to carry the forming creatures in their divine wombs for what the tablets describe as a gestation period, 10 months by some readings. The text specifies counting months, marking time, waiting for the proper development before birth. When the time comes, the births are recorded with the same attention to procedure. The goddesses labor. The mixed ones emerge, not fully divine, but no longer merely earthly. They carry within them the blood of Wei-Ilu, the intelligence of a god, the awareness that separates human from animal. But they are bound to earth, shaped from it, destined to return to it. They will age, they will die, they will know their mortality, even as they bear the trace of something immortal within their veins. The Igigi are released from their labor. The new creatures, the humans, are assigned the work instead. And Enlil, harsh administrator, accepts the solution with what might be satisfaction or might be resignation. The work will continue. The cosmos will be maintained. Order is restored. The rebellion is ended, not through violence, but through innovation, through the creation of a new category of being, something that had not existed before, something designed specifically to serve. The tablets do not describe this as divine love making humanity. They describe divine exhaustion requiring humanity. In other versions of the story, the details shift, but the essence remains. The Eridu Genesis, fragmentary and older still, speaks of gods creating humans after the land has been prepared, but before cities exist. Humanity emerges to provide labor for establishing civilization, for building the temples, for maintaining the sacred order. The Sumerian text, known as the Song of the Ho, describes humans emerging from a hole in the earth at Nippur, broken through by Enlil's hoe, another image of creation as agricultural act, as cultivation of useful life from raw material. But it is the Atrahasis version that lingers with its uncomfortable specificity. The clay and blood, the mixing and molding, the gestation and birth. The purpose clearly stated: to bear the yoke the gods refuse, to work so that divinity need not. We are designed, the tablets tell us, for service, and yet within that design lies something the creators perhaps did not anticipate. The divine blood grants more than mere intelligence. It grants the capacity for consciousness, for self-awareness, for recognizing one's own condition. Humans know they are mortal. They understand their purpose. They are aware of the divine essence they carry and the earthly limitation that constrains it. This awareness, neither fully God nor fully animal, becomes the defining tension of human existence, as the tablets recorded. The irony is almost tender. The Anunnaki create servants capable of complex thought so they can perform complex labor. But thought, once granted, cannot be limited to assigned tasks. Consciousness spills beyond boundaries. Humans begin to multiply, to spread, to develop their own desires and purposes beyond the maintenance of divine estates. Within generations, or perhaps centuries, the texts suggest, humanity becomes not merely workers, but a civilization of their own, building cities, making laws, generating the noise and complication that will eventually disturb the gods who made them. The same creation that solved one problem creates another. The servants develop agency, the workers develop will, and the gods having granted intelligence to make them useful, cannot take it back without losing the very capacity that makes them valuable. Perhaps this is why later traditions will reframe the story. The Hebrew text borrows the clay and breath, transforming divine blood into divine spirit, violence into gentleness, necessity into love. But the older version remains in the tablets, unrepentant in its pragmatism. Humanity was not wished into being by benevolent creator. Humanity was engineered to solve a problem, mixed from earth and the blood of a slain god, born from necessity rather than affection. It is strange how that origin persists in subtle ways. Every ancient culture that builds from Mesopotamian influence carries some version of clay and divine essence, of humanity as mixed being, neither wholly earthly nor wholly divine. The Greek Prometheus molds humans from earth and water, stealing fire from the gods to give them consciousness. The Egyptian Khnum shapes humans on his potter's wheel. Across the ancient world, the same image, humans formed from earth, granted awareness from above, existing in the tension between the two. But none describe the process with the mechanical detail of the Atrahasis epic. None specify the rebellion that preceded creation, the sacrifice required, the gestation period, the 7 pairs, the immediate assignment to labor. These details feel less like myth, meant to inspire wonder, and more like account meant to document procedure. What if the tablets describe not magic, but methodology? What if the blood and clay were not metaphor but materials? What if creation was not miracle but process? Something done deliberately, with technique, following steps that could be recorded for remembrance or perhaps repetition. The questions hang in the air above the clay, and the clay, as always, simply records. Human beings, it tells us, carry within them something divine, not because they were loved into existence, but because divinity was necessary to make them functional. The trace of God in human consciousness is not blessing but ingredient, mixed into the clay to produce beings capable of the work required. We are servants who remember being made for service. And in that memory, preserved in tablets pressed by reed into wet earth 5,000 years ago, lies the uncomfortable foundation of how Mesopotamia understood human purpose and human limitation. The Anunnaki needed workers. They made workers. Those workers inherited divine consciousness and earthly mortality in equal measure, becoming something neither God nor animal, something in between, something capable of knowing what they were made for and questioning whether that purpose defines them still. The relationship between created and creator, then, was never simple devotion. It was contract. Humans served because they were designed to serve. The gods protected because they needed humanity functional. When that contract balanced, civilization flourished. When it broke, catastrophe followed. And the tablets record both, the long periods of service and the moments when even the gods who made humanity wondered whether their creation had been wise. In the Sumerian king list, a document that chronicles rulers from the beginning of time, there is a phrase that appears again and again: before the flood. It marks a boundary between ages, a line drawn across history by water. And before that flood, the kings ruled for impossible lengths. Alulim of Eridu reigned for 28,800 years. Alalgar held power for 36,000 years. Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years. The text does not apologize for these numbers. It records them as a matter of fact, as if time worked differently then, as if the early world operated under laws we no longer recognize or remember. After the flood, the reign shortened. Kings rule for hundreds of years rather than tens of thousands. Then hundreds become decades. The divine gives way gradually to the mortal. The text tracks this transition without comment, listing names and numbers in the same steady cuneiform, as though the shift from impossible to merely implausible to historically verifiable was simply the natural progression of ages. But what lived in that space before the flood? What manner of kings were these? The tablets suggest they were not entirely human. Each major city in Sumer had its patron deity, its Anunnaki guardian assigned by the Council of Gods. Eridu, the first city according to Mesopotamian tradition, belonged to Enki, lord of the sweet waters that rose from beneath the earth, god of wisdom and craftsmanship and hidden knowledge. His temple there, the Eabzu, the house of the cosmic waters, stood as the first sanctuary, the prototype from which all later temples would be designed. To live in Eridu was to live under Enki's direct rule, to be part of his estate, his workers, his responsibility. Nippur, the religious center of all Sumer, was Enlil's domain. His temple, the Ekur, the mountain house, functioned as the cosmic axis, the point where heaven and earth met. Decisions made in Nippur carried divine authority. The tablet of destinies resided there, the cosmic charter that granted whoever possessed it the right to determine fate. Kings from other cities traveled to Nippur to receive legitimacy, to stand before Enlil's shrine and be confirmed in their rule. Without that confirmation, kingship remained merely human ambition rather than divinely sanctioned order. Uruk belonged to Inanna, goddess of love and war, the morning and evening star. She was daughter of Anu, or sometimes of Nanna the moon, sister to Utu the sun, beloved and terrible in equal measure. Her city became the greatest in early Sumer, its walls so massive they impressed even the epic poets who sang of them millennia later. To rule Uruk meant navigating Inanna's favor, her passions that could elevate a king to glory or destroy him on impulse. The relationship between city and goddess was intimate, volatile, immediate. The pattern repeated across the land between the rivers. Ur belonged to Nanna, the moon, Lhasa to Utu, the sun, Lagash to Ningirsu, warrior son of Enlil. Each city functioned as divine estate, and its human population served both practical and sacred purposes, maintaining the physical infrastructure while also performing the rituals that kept cosmic order aligned. The gods did not rule from distant heaven. They dwelt in their temples, present in their cities, involved in daily administration through priests and kings who acted as their representatives. But the Anunnaki also interacted directly. The texts record their movements between cities, their visits and interventions. When Inanna desired greater power for Uruk, she did not petition or pray. She traveled to Eridu to visit her father Enki. The story of that visit, preserved in multiple tablets, reads like political intrigue dressed in divine costume. Inanna arrives at Enki's temple, where he greets her with a feast. They drink beer together, cup after cup, until Enki grows drunk and expansive. Inanna, still clear-headed, or at least more calculating, asks for gifts. And Enki, in his intoxication, grants her the Emi. The Me were not abstract concepts. They were powers, decrees, fundamental aspects of civilization that could be possessed, transferred, even stolen. There were more than 100 of them listed in various texts. Kingship was a Me. Priesthood was a Me. Writing, warfare, music, sexual intimacy, craftsmanship, law. Each was a me, a portable essence of civilized function. Whoever held the me for a particular domain controlled that domain's expression in the world. They were almost like technologies, knowledge encoded into transferable form. Enki gave Inanna the me for kingship, for priesthood, for descent into the underworld, for warfare, for judgment. When he sobered and realized what he had done, he sent his vizier to retrieve them. But Inanna had already fled, racing back to Uruk with the me clutched in her possession. Enki's attempts to stop her failed. The me remained in Uruk. The city's power grew. The story ends with Inanna victorious, Enki resigned, and the fundamental distribution of cosmic authority permanently altered. If this is mythology, it is mythology that functions like history. Inanna's acquisition of the me reads as an origin story for Uruk's political and religious prominence, a narrative explaining how one city came to hold powers that originally belonged elsewhere. The gods are characters in a drama of cultural and political shift, and the me are the mechanisms by which that shift occurs. In the underworld, the Anunnaki took another form. 7 of them, the texts tell us, sat as judges of the dead. When a soul descended into the realm of Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, it passed before these 7 to receive judgment on the life it had lived. The tablets describe them as stern, implacable, their gazes fixing the dead with the weight of cosmic law. What they judged remains less clear: service, piety, adherence to the terms of human creation. The texts do not specify the criteria, only the consequence. Judgment determined one's fate in the afterlife, and that judgment came from the same council that had authorized human creation in the first place. Above ground, some texts suggest that unions between gods and humans produced semi-divine offspring. Kings claimed descent from divine bloodlines, tracing ancestry back to unions between Anunnaki and mortal women. Whether literal or symbolic, these claims serve to legitimize rule, to place certain lineages in the space between human and divine, closer to the creators than to common humanity. The king was not merely appointed by the gods. He carried their blood, diluted perhaps across generations, but present still, granting him authority that transcended simple political power. Yet for all this intimacy, for all the marriages and visits and direct rule, the relationship between Anunnaki and humanity eventually soured. The tablets tell of growing tension, of divine frustration with their creation. Humanity multiplied. The cities grew crowded and loud. The noise of human activity, the constant bustle and clamor of civilization, disturbed the gods who dwelt among them. Enlil, in particular, found the situation intolerable. The Atrahasis epic describes his complaint with almost comic annoyance. The noise, the huburu, kept him awake. Humanity had become too numerous, too loud, too present. What had begun as solution to one problem had created another. The servants had thrived beyond their purpose. They no longer simply maintained divine estates. They had their own lives, their own purposes, their own endless noise. Enlil proposed solutions that grew increasingly drastic. First, he sent plague to reduce the numbers. Enki countered by teaching humans healing. Then Enlil tried drought. Enki showed humans irrigation. Famine. Enki revealed stored food. Each divine attempt to limit humanity was circumvented by divine assistance. The Council of Anunnaki was divided, with Enlil determined to restore quiet order, and Enki quietly undermining those efforts to preserve the species he had helped create. Finally, Enlil demanded the ultimate solution, A flood, total cleansing, the eradication of the noisemakers, and a return to divine peace. The council agreed, but Enki, Lord of Wisdom, and apparently of conscience, or perhaps merely of attachment to his creation, could not allow complete destruction. The tablets record how he approached the reed wall of a house where a man named Ziusudra lived, or Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim, depending on which version preserves the story. Enki spoke to the wall rather than directly to the man, a technicality that allowed him to warn humanity without explicitly violating the council's decree. The wall, he said, should tell its inhabitant to tear down his house and build a boat. Specific dimensions, specific materials. Bring aboard representatives of every living thing. A flood was coming that would destroy all life on earth. The man obeyed. The boat was built. The rains came. The texts described the gods themselves trembling at the destruction they had unleashed, huddling together like frightened dogs as the waters rose and rose. They had not anticipated their own horror at what they had decreed. Without humanity to maintain the temples, to offer food and drink, the gods went hungry. They realized too late that they needed the servants they had condemned. When the waters receded and the boat came to rest on a mountain, when Ziusudra emerged and offered sacrifice, the smell of the roasting meat drew the gods like flies, the tablets say, starving and desperate. Enlil arrived last, furious to discover a survivor, furious that his decree had been circumvented, but the other gods intervened. Humanity must not be completely destroyed. They needed the workers. The solution was compromise. Humans would continue to exist, but with limits, shorter lifespans, increased mortality, natural checks on population. The noise would be controlled not through extinction, but through constraint. And so the relationship was renegotiated. The pre-flood world ended. The age of impossible rains and direct divine presence gave way to something more distant, more mediated. The kings listed after the flood in the Sumerian king list ruled for centuries rather than millennia, then lifetimes rather than centuries, until finally the numbers matched what archaeological evidence could confirm. The Anunnaki did not leave, but they withdrew, becoming gradually less present, less immediate. The texts from later periods speak of them differently, as distant powers invoked through ritual rather than neighbors who walked the streets. The intimacy faded. Divine rule became divine sanction. The gods remained in their temples, but the contact grew formal, structured through priesthood, an offering rather than direct encounter. Perhaps the flood was the turning point. The moment when the relationship between creator and created transformed from presence to memory, from walking among humanity to watching from above. The tablets mark that boundary with water, with the phrase repeated across chronicles and king lists. Before the flood, after the flood. 2 ages, 2 modes of divine-human relationship. And in that transition, perhaps, the beginning of what we now call mythology, as gods who once walked became gods who were remembered as having walked. Present tense becoming past. Neighbors becoming legends. The Sumerians knew things they should not have known. They mapped the solar system with planets invisible to the naked eye. They calculated lunar cycles with precision that took modern astronomy centuries to match. They described the precession of the equinoxes, a 26,000-year wobble of Earth's axis that requires generations of continuous observation to detect. Their mathematical system, base, 60, still governs how we measure time and angles. Their astronomical tablets chart planetary periods accurate to within fractions of a degree. How did a civilization that emerged from reed huts and marshland acquire knowledge that seems to require telescopes and centuries of accumulated data? The tablets offer an answer that sounds less like discovery and more like transmission. The Anunnaki taught them. In text after text, the gods appear not merely as objects of worship, but as sources of practical knowledge. Enki teaches humanity the arts of civilization, agriculture, irrigation, animal husbandry, the working of metals, the measurement of land and time. He is called Ushumgal, the great dragon, and Abgal, the wise one, terms that suggest not only power, but expertise, technical mastery that could be shared. The me he possessed and occasionally granted to others were not abstract blessings, but specific capacities, transmissible skills, and understanding that elevated human capability from survival to civilization. When the Sumerians built their first cities, they did not build tentatively, experimenting through generations of trial and error. They built with sophistication that appeared almost complete from the beginning. Uruk's walls, constructed before 3000 BCE, required engineering knowledge of load-bearing, of foundation laying, of organizing labor on massive scale. The ziggurats that rose across Mesopotamia were not simple pyramids, but complex step structures with precise mathematical proportions, internal staircases, drainage systems, foundations that accounted for the unstable marshland soil. These were not primitive attempts at architecture. They were executed designs. The astronomical knowledge especially troubles conventional timelines. The Emul Apin tablets, copied and recopied across centuries, but preserving observations surely older, contain star catalogues listing constellations, rising times, planetary paths. They describe Venus's cycle with precision, noting its 8-year pattern of appearances and disappearances. They track Jupiter's movements, Saturn's orbit, even Mars's peculiar retrograde motion. These observations require decades of careful watching, of recording positions, of recognizing patterns that repeat only across long spans of time. But it is the knowledge of planets beyond naked eye visibility that creates the deepest puzzle. Some interpretations of Sumerian cylinder seals suggest awareness of the full solar system, including planets not officially discovered until the telescope age. Whether these interpretations hold, or whether they impose modern knowledge onto ancient symbols, remains debated. Yet even the conservative reading presents difficulty. The Sumerians tracked celestial movements with an accuracy that seems to demand technology they did not possess, or patience that exceeds reasonable expectation. They also understood mathematics in ways that shaped all subsequent civilizations. Base 60 mathematics, sexagesimal counting, divided the circle into 360 degrees, the hour into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds. This was not intuitive choice. Base 10 aligns with human fingers. Base 60 is abstract, chosen for its mathematical properties, its divisibility by many numbers, its elegance for astronomical calculation. Who makes that choice at the beginning of civilization? Who decides to structure all measurement around a system that makes complex calculation easier, but simple counting harder? The same tablets that record myths and kings also record mathematical problems. Compound interest calculations, geometric progressions, algebraic solutions that would not appear in other cultures for thousands of years. The Plimpton 322 tablet, dating to roughly 1800 BCE, but surely reflecting older knowledge, contains what appear to be Pythagorean triples, the mathematical relationships between sides of right triangles that would not be discovered by Pythagoras until a millennium and a half later. Did the Sumerians discover this independently, or were they remembering something already known? Agriculture, too, appeared with suspicious sophistication. The irrigation systems that transformed southern Mesopotamia from marshland to productive farmland required understanding of water flow, of seasonal flooding patterns, of soil salinity management. The Sumerians did not merely plant crops. They rotated them, understanding somehow that different plants affected soil differently, that variety prevented depletion. They bred animals selectively, developing domestic strains from wild predecessors with efficiency that suggests guided knowledge rather than random experimentation. Metallurgy followed the same pattern. The Bronze Age begins in Mesopotamia, the mixing of copper and tin in precise proportions to create alloy stronger than either component alone. But how does one discover those proportions? Random mixing might eventually stumble upon the right combination, but the Sumerians seem to know the ratios from the beginning, as though following formula rather than discovering through trial. The same with later developments, smelting techniques, alloying variations, the use of particular ores for particular purposes. The progression feels too swift, too assured. Medical texts from Sumerian and later Akkadian sources describe surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, diagnostic techniques. They identify diseases by symptom, prescribe treatments that combined what we would call medicine with ritual. But the medical component shows awareness of bodily systems, of cause and effect, of dosage and preparation that goes beyond folk remedy into something approaching systematic understanding. The plants used for healing were not local to Mesopotamia. Someone had to know where to find them, how to prepare them, what they treated. The legal codes too emerge with startling completeness. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dating to around 2100 BCE, predates the more famous Code of Hammurabi by 3 centuries. It establishes principles of justice, of compensation for injury, of property rights and social obligation. These are not primitive laws evolving slowly toward fairness. They are sophisticated legal thought, recognizing different classes of offense, different levels of restitution, the concept of precedent and proportion. Where did such legal philosophy originate in a civilization barely 1,000 years old? The tablets credit the Anunnaki. Utu, the sun god, is called the judge, the one who establishes justice in the land. Nana, the moon, measures time and thereby makes contracts possible, for contract requires ability to mark duration and enforce terms across temporal distance. Enlil grants kingship, but with it comes the responsibility of maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order that includes earthly justice. The laws are not human invention but divine decree, the me of justice transferred to humanity through the mechanism of kingship. Perhaps this is simply how ancient peoples understood innovation, attributing all advancement to divine teaching, because they lacked concept of human progress. Every culture credits its gods with gifts of civilization: fire from Prometheus, agriculture from Demeter, writing from Thoth. The pattern repeats because humans need origin stories for their capabilities, not because those stories reflect literal transmission. And yet, the Mesopotamian accounts possess a detail that others lack. When Greek myth speaks of Prometheus stealing fire, it is metaphor, symbol, teaching through story. When Sumerian tablets speak of Enki teaching irrigation, they describe specific techniques, list the tools used, explain the practical steps. The difference in tone is striking. One sounds like mythology meant to inspire. The other sounds like documentation meant to preserve. Modern explanations for Sumerian advancement typically invoke cultural diffusion, the gradual accumulation of knowledge through trade and contact with neighboring peoples. The Sumerians learned agriculture from earlier settlements. They absorbed metallurgical techniques from Anatolian traders. They developed mathematics through practical needs of accounting and land division. Each innovation built on previous innovation, and the speed of advancement only seems sudden because the archaeological record is incomplete, leaving gaps that create illusion of leaps rather than steps. This explanation satisfies academic requirements for naturalistic development, yet it struggles with the specific details. The base 60 mathematics has no apparent predecessor. The astronomical observations require continuity of record-keeping across generations, yet the writing system that would enable such continuity appears simultaneously with the observations it should have developed to record. The sophistication appears not at the culmination of long development, but at the beginning, as though civilization arrived already educated. Alternative interpretations, most famously articulated by Zecharia Sitchin in the 1970s, propose reading the tablets more literally. The Anunnaki were not gods, but extraterrestrial beings who came to Earth seeking resources, primarily gold, for purposes the texts allegedly describe. They genetically engineered humans from existing hominids, mixing their DNA with terrestrial life to create workers capable of mining and processing. All Sumerian advancement came from this technological transfer, and the myths are actually historical accounts of ancient contact, preserved in religious language, because later generations lost understanding of the technical realities being described. Academic Sumerologists reject these translations as fundamentally flawed, built on misreadings of cuneiform, ignoring grammatical context, inserting modern concepts into ancient language. The word Sitchin translates as spacecraft, scholars note, simply means divine boat, a ritual object or metaphorical vessel. The genetic engineering passages describe mythological creation using symbolic language of blood and clay, not DNA manipulation. The astronomical claims impose knowledge onto ambiguous symbols, finding planets where the tablets describe stars or simply decorative patterns. The debate produces more heat than light, with each side accusing the other of blindness. Academics see pseudoscience imposing fantasy onto fragments of ancient religion. Alternative researchers see closed-minded orthodoxy refusing to consider evidence that challenges comfortable narratives. The tablets sit between them, silent accomplices to both interpretations, their cuneiform wedges capable of supporting multiple readings depending on what assumptions one brings to the translation. What cannot be disputed is the knowledge itself. The Sumerians possessed it. They recorded it. They built with it. They measured time and space with precision that would not be matched for millennia. Whether that knowledge developed naturally over time or was transmitted from external source, the civilization that emerged between the Tigris and Euphrates transformed human capability from subsistence to sophistication within a remarkably compressed time frame. The me, those portable decrees of civilization, serve as almost perfect metaphor for knowledge transfer. They could be possessed, stolen, granted, lost. They were specific rather than general, not merely wisdom, but the me of kingship, of priesthood, of irrigation, of bronze working. When Inanna stole the me from Enki, she did not gain abstract blessing but concrete capabilities that elevated Uruk's status and power. The me function almost like technology packages, like data that can be downloaded and applied, transforming capacity in whoever receives them. If the Anunnaki existed as the tablets describe them, then their greatest gift was not construction or even creation, but education. The transformation of humans from mere workers into beings capable of building their own cities, writing their own laws, measuring their own world. Perhaps that is why the relationship eventually grew strained. The students surpassed the need for constant instruction. The servants developed their own agency. The created beings began creating on their own. And the gods, having taught humanity too well, found themselves less necessary, their presence less essential, their role gradually obsolete. The sudden flowering of knowledge that characterizes Sumerian civilization remains one of archaeology's persistent puzzles. Whether explained through gradual development, through cultural diffusion, through divine teaching, or through more exotic interventions, the fact remains, something happened in southern Mesopotamia between 4000 and 3000 BCE that transformed human capability. The tablets attribute that transformation to the Anunnaki. And whether we read that attribution as theology, as memory, or as metaphor, the knowledge itself endures, carved into clay, preserved across 5 millennia, still teaching those who study it how humans first learned to measure the heavens and shape the earth. The decision to destroy humanity was not made lightly, the tablets tell us. In the council of the Anunnaki, voices rose in disagreement. The earth had grown too loud. Humanity, created to relieve divine labor, had multiplied beyond intention, beyond control. Cities sprawled across the marshlands. The noise of human existence, the hoobaroo, the tumult of voices and commerce and endless activity echoed up to heaven like accusation. Enlil, lord of the air, administrator of cosmic order, found the sound unbearable. He could not rest. The servants had become the disturbance. Perhaps it was never about the noise. Perhaps the noise was simply the evidence of something deeper, the realization that the created had exceeded their design. Humans were meant to serve, to maintain divine estates, to offer sustenance and labor without complication. But consciousness, once granted, develops its own momentum. The intelligence necessary for complex work is also intelligence capable of desire, ambition, independence. The beings made to serve had begun to live for themselves. The Atrahasis epic records Enlil's escalating frustration with methodical detail. First, he sent disease. Plague swept through the cities, reducing populations, quieting the noise. But Enki, Lord of Wisdom and humanity's secret advocate, taught humans the arts of healing, herbal remedies, surgical techniques, quarantine procedures. The plague passed. Humanity recovered. The noise resumed. Enlil tried drought next. He withheld the rains that fed the rivers, turned fertile land to dust. Surely this would reduce their numbers, restore the quiet balance. But Enki showed humans how to dig deeper wells, how to store water, how to irrigate from underground sources. The drought killed many, but not all. The survivors adapted. The civilization persisted. Then famine. Enlil locked away the grains, prevented the fields from producing. Starvation should have accomplished what disease and drought could not. Yet Enki revealed to humans the plants that could sustain them, the fish that filled the rivers, the techniques of preservation that could stretch meager harvests across lean years. Again, humanity survived. Again, the noise returned, perhaps quieter, but still present, still disturbing the peace Enlil demanded. The texts describe a council meeting where Enlil's patience finally shattered. 4 times he had tried to limit humanity. 4 times his efforts had been circumvented by divine interference. The pattern was clear. Enki would not allow humanity's destruction. But Enlil held authority. He was lord of the air and earth, keeper of the tablets of destinies. If he decreed annihilation, the other gods would have to comply or face rebellion against the established order. He proposed the flood. Not a normal flood, not the seasonal rising of rivers that the Mesopotamians knew well. A deluge that would erase all life, that would cleanse the earth completely, that would restore the world to its pre-human silence. The waters above and below would be released, drowning everything that breathed. No more noise, no more disturbance, a return to divine peace. The council deliberated. Some gods supported Enlil's plan, weary themselves of humanity's complications. Others hesitated. Nintu, who had shaped humans from clay, grieved at the thought of losing her creations. But Enlil's will prevailed. The decree was made. The gods swore an oath, binding themselves to secrecy, ensuring that humanity would receive no warning of what was coming. The flood would be absolute, the erasure complete. Enki, who had opposed every attempt to limit humanity, found himself bound by oath he could not break. He could not warn humans directly. To do so would be rebellion against the council's decree, violation of the oath that held divine order together. Yet he could not simply allow the extinction of beings he had helped create, whose intelligence came from the blood of a god he himself had authorized to be slain. The solution he found was technical, almost legalistic. He approached the reed wall of a house in Shuruppak, where a man lived who had found favor through piety and justice. The texts name him differently in different versions: Ziusudra in Sumerian, Atrahasis in Akkadian, Utnapishtim in the later Gilgamesh epic. But the pattern remains constant. Enki spoke to the wall, not to the man. He told the wall what was coming, gave the wall specific instructions. Tear down this house. Use the materials to build a boat. These are the dimensions. This is the structure. Bring aboard your family, your craftsmen, representatives of every living creature. A flood is coming that will destroy all flesh. The man heard. Whether through the wall or through dream or through some other indirect channel, the warning reached him. He obeyed. The tablets describe the construction with the same technical detail they bring to creation, as though the survival of life required precision equal to its original formation. The boat was to be square, not long and narrow like later ark imaginings, roofed over completely, sealed with bitumen against the water, compartments for animals, provisions for an extended voyage without knowing when or where landfall might occur. When the boat was complete and loaded, the rains began. Not gentle rain, but torrential, violent, accompanied by storms that seemed to tear the sky apart. The Anunnaki themselves trembled at what they had unleashed. The tablets described them cowering like dogs, pressed against outer walls of heaven, shocked by the magnitude of destruction they had decreed. They had not imagined the horror of watching an entire world drown. Nintu wept, lamenting that she had agreed to the annihilation of beings she had shaped with her own hands. The other gods huddled with her, themselves suffering as the waters rose and rose, covering fields and cities, mountains and temples. And in their suffering came realization. They had made a terrible mistake. Without humans to maintain the temples, no one offered them food. Without humans to perform the rituals, the daily sustenance that gods required ceased. The Anunnaki grew hungry. 7 days and 7 nights the flood raged. When it finally subsided, when the waters began to recede and the boat came to rest on a mountain, the man emerged and offered sacrifice. He lit a fire, burned offerings of meat and grain. The smell rose up to where the gods waited, and they gathered around like flies, the tablets say, drawn by hunger to the first offering they had received since the flood began. Enlil arrived last. When he saw the boat, when he realized a human had survived, his rage rekindled. Who had betrayed the oath? Who had warned humanity? The decree had been absolute. The erasure was to be total. Enki stepped forward. He had not broken the oath, he argued. He had spoken to a wall, not to a human. If the wall chose to pass along information, that was the wall's decision, not his. The other gods, hungry and grateful that offerings could resume, supported Enki's technicality. They needed humans. The silence they had sought was intolerable. The quiet was worse than the noise. A compromise was reached. Humanity would survive, but with new limitations. The lifespans that had stretched for centuries would be shortened. The fertility that had produced overwhelming numbers would be checked by natural limits. Some women would be barren. Some children would not survive. Birth, disease and accident would reduce populations before they could grow too large. Death would become more present, more regular, more expected. The gods would no longer walk as freely among humans. The intimacy would decrease. Distance would be built into the relationship, protection against future attachment that might make another decree of destruction impossible to execute. Ziusudra, or Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim, received special blessing for his obedience. He and his wife were granted immortality, removed from human time, placed at the edge of the world where they would live forever, neither fully divine nor any longer mortal. The gift was both reward and removal, honoring the man who preserved life while ensuring he could never again be part of the human community he had saved. The flood marked a boundary. Before it, gods and humans lived in closer proximity, divine rule more direct, human lifespans longer, the relationship more immediate. After it, distance increased. The age of the antediluvian kings, with their impossible reigns measured in tens of thousands of years, gave way to historical kingship measured in lifetimes. The gods remained present in their temples, but less visibly active in daily affairs. The covenant between divine and human was renegotiated on terms that acknowledged mutual dependence but also mutual wariness. Archaeological evidence hints at historical floods in Mesopotamia, water deposits in the strata at Ur and Shuruppak and other sites, dated to around 2900 BCE or perhaps earlier. Whether these local catastrophes, devastating but not global, provided the foundation for the flood myth, or whether the myth preserves memory of something larger, remains debated. What matters is not the historical reality of a specific flood, but the meaning the story carries. Every ancient culture remembers a great flood. The Mesopotamian version is simply the oldest written account, predating the biblical story by a millennium, predating Greek and Roman versions by longer still. The pattern repeats with remarkable consistency. A god or gods decide to destroy humanity. One man receives warning and builds a vessel. Representatives of life are preserved. Waters cover the earth. The vessel comes to rest on a mountain. Offerings are made. The world begins again. From Mesopotamia to India to Greece to the Americas, the same structure recurs, suggesting either a common root or a common human need to imagine apocalypse and survival, to tell stories of cosmic cleansing and the continuity of life through catastrophe. But the Mesopotamian version carries details the others lack: the council debate, the specific reasons for destruction, the divine regret, the hunger that drives gods back to humanity, the compromise that allows survival with limitations. These elements make the flood feel less like divine caprice and more like consequence, the inevitable correction when creation exceeds its bounds, when the relationship between maker and made loses its balance. Enlil represents order, authority, the demand for respect and quiet service. Enki represents wisdom, creativity, the attachment that comes from having made something and wanting to see it continue. The tension between them drives not just the flood narrative, but the entire relationship between Anunnaki and humanity. One demands obedience within strict limits. The other grants knowledge that enables transcendence of those limits. One seeks to maintain hierarchy. The other seems almost to want humanity to grow beyond its designed purpose. The flood resolves this tension temporarily through compromise. Humanity continues, but constrained. The gods remain, but more distant. The noise is controlled, but not eliminated. Neither side achieves total victory. And perhaps that is the point. The relationship between divine and human, between creator and created, cannot be simple dominance or simple partnership. It must be negotiation, ongoing and imperfect, with both sides learning through error and adjustment what coexistence requires. When the waters receded and humanity emerged to rebuild, they carried forward the memory of near extinction. They knew themselves to be survivors of divine judgment, spared not through their own worthiness, but through the mercy or wisdom of one God working against the decree of another. They had seen the cost of growing too loud, too numerous, too confident. The flood became not just a historical event, but perpetual warning. Existence is conditional. Continuation depends on balance, and the forces that created can also destroy. The tablets record this with neither triumph nor despair. The flood came. Humanity survived. The world began again under new terms. The Anunnaki, for all their power, had learned they needed what they had made. And humanity, for all its growth, had learned it remained dependent on divine forbearance. The relationship continued, transformed by catastrophe into something more complex than simple service, more fraught than simple worship, more honest in acknowledging the creators and created were bound together in ways neither fully controlled. There is a shift in the tablets, subtle but unmistakable. The earlier texts speak of gods who walk streets, who eat bread in temple courtyards, who marry human women and argue about inheritances. The later texts speak of gods in heaven, distant figures requiring intermediaries, cosmic forces more than physical presences. The Anunnaki do not vanish suddenly. They fade like stars at dawn, present but increasingly difficult to perceive, until only their names remain carved into prayers that invoke them without expecting direct response. The transition spans centuries, perhaps a millennium, trackable through changes in how texts describe divine-human interaction. In the earliest Sumerian sources, gods attend festivals, participate in city politics, express preferences about mundane matters of governance and agriculture. By the time Babylonian scribes are copying these stories 1,000 years later, the gods have become more abstract, their actions mediated through dreams and omens rather than direct appearance, their will interpreted by priests rather than spoken in market squares. What changed? Perhaps nothing about the gods themselves, if gods they were, but everything about how humanity perceived them. The flood had established new terms. Distance had been built into the relationship as protection against the intimacy that had led to catastrophe. Or perhaps the natural progression of civilization simply carried human culture away from whatever initial contact had occurred, each generation a step further from the source, until the memory of presence became tradition, and tradition became mythology, and mythology became what scholars study rather than what people live. The political structure of divine authority evolved alongside this perceptual shift. In earlier Sumer, kingship seemed to descend directly from heaven, with rulers understood to be either gods themselves or so closely related to divinity that the distinction barely mattered. The king lists record this without embarrassment. Before the flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years because they were not quite human. After the flood, rulers claimed divine parentage or divine selection, their authority flowing from Anunnaki decree, but their bodies subject to mortal limitation. By the Akkadian period, when Sargon unified the Mesopotamian city-states around 2300 BCE, kingship had become more explicitly human, though still divinely sanctioned. Sargon did not claim to be a god, but he claimed to rule by divine right, authorized by the Anunnaki through signs and victories that demonstrated heavenly favor. His daughter Enheduanna, high priestess of the moon god Nanna, wrote hymns that addressed the gods with reverence, but also with a distance that earlier texts lacked. She spoke to them rather than recording their speeches, petitioned them rather than documenting their commands. The pattern continued through the succeeding empires. The Ur III dynasty attempted to restore the old intimacy, with kings like Shulgi claiming divine status and receiving worship in temples built for their cults. But these claims felt increasingly performative, political theater rather than genuine belief. The gods were withdrawing into cosmic distance, and human claims to divinity grew more insistent precisely because direct divine presence was fading from common experience. Then came Babylon's ascendance, and with it a theological revolution that formalized the transition. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, composed sometime around 1100 BCE, retells the old Sumerian stories with crucial differences. Marduk, patron god of Babylon, takes center stage. The older Anunnaki remain, but their power is superseded. Marduk defeats Tiamat, the primordial chaos, and from her body creates the ordered cosmos. In reward for this victory, he is granted kingship over all gods, absorbing their powers, bearing 50 names that catalogue his supremacy. This was not merely mythology, it was political theology. Babylon had become the dominant power in Mesopotamia, and Marduk's elevation reflected that earthly dominance. The old gods, the original Anunnaki of Sumerian tradition, were not erased, but subordinated, integrated into a new hierarchy with a Babylonian deity at its apex. Anu, Enlil, Enki, all the ancient names retain their places, but now as lesser figures in Marduk's court, their independent authority diminished, their ancient powers now aspects of Marduk's unified rule. The theological innovation served practical purposes. A fragmented pantheon with competing divine authorities mirrored and perhaps encouraged political fragmentation. But an empire required unified cosmic order. If Marduk ruled all gods, then Babylon's king, ruling in Marduk's name, could claim authority over all territories those gods had once governed independently. Divine consolidation enabled political consolidation. The Anunnaki's withdrawal from direct human involvement made this transition possible. Distant gods could be reorganized more easily than present ones. In this new framework, the Anunnaki took on increasingly specialized roles. Many became primarily astral deities, identified with celestial bodies and celestial mechanics. Shamash, the sun god, Sin, the moon, Ishtar, the evening star. Their movements through the heavens determined auspicious times for planting, for warfare, for coronations and contracts. They remained powerful, but in ways that felt more natural than personal, cosmic principles rather than willful personalities. The stars moved in predictable patterns. The gods had become their movements, their power expressed through astronomical law rather than individual decision. Other Anunnaki retained their ancient role as judges of the dead, but little else. The seven who sat in the underworld evaluating souls remained in that function, but their involvement in earthly affairs ceased. They had become specialized, relegated to one domain, no longer the comprehensive administrators of all aspects of existence. The bureaucracy of heaven had been streamlined, consolidated, rationalized in ways that made it more comprehensible and less immediate. As Babylonian dominance gave way to Assyrian conquest, the pattern repeated with local variation. The Assyrians elevated Ashur to supreme position, telling similar stories of cosmic battle and divine reorganization, installing their patron deity atop the hierarchy while maintaining the structure beneath. The old gods continued, their names invoked, their festivals celebrated, but always now as part of a system rather than as independent powers. The Anunnaki had become what bureaucracies always become over time, standardized, regularized, their individual characters fading into their official functions. By the first millennium BCE, Mesopotamian religion had evolved into something that would feel familiar to later monotheistic traditions. Though polytheistic in structure, it functioned monotheistically in practice. The supreme deity, whether Marduk or Ashur, or in some regions still Enlil, received the bulk of devotion and authority. The other gods remained but as aspects, attributes, specialized servants of the cosmic order rather than independent actors within it. The wild, unpredictable presence of the early Sumerian gods had been domesticated into theological order. This theological evolution occurred as Jewish civilization was taking shape. Abraham, according to tradition, came from Ur of the Chaldees, from the heart of Mesopotamian culture. The Jewish exile in Babylon during the 6th century BCE brought sustained contact between the inheritors of Sumerian tradition and the developers of what would become Judaism. Genesis, compiled during or after this period, carries unmistakable echoes of Mesopotamian creation accounts, flood narratives, divine councils, but the Jewish texts transform the polytheistic framework into monotheistic revolution, taking the trend toward divine consolidation to its logical extreme. Not one God over many, but one God alone. The Anunnaki, in this transformation, became something troubling to monotheistic theology. They were the sons of God mentioned in Genesis, who saw the daughters of humans and took them as wives, producing the Nephilim, the giants, the heroes of old. They were the divine council that surrounded Yahweh in the Psalms, witnessing but not participating in divine judgment. They were remembered but reframed, no longer gods themselves, but angels, servants, creations rather than creators. The theological architecture remained, but its meaning had shifted. Where Mesopotamia saw multiple centers of divine power, Judaism saw one power with multiple servants. The consolidation that began in Babylon completed itself in Jerusalem. Christianity and Islam would inherit this structure, each further abstracting the divine, moving from the Mesopotamian gods who ate and drank and argued to the transcendent, omnipotent, singular God who creates through word alone. The distance that began as gradual withdrawal became absolute separation between divine and earthly realms. The Anunnaki's fading presence had made possible the conception of divinity as wholly other, entirely separate from material existence. Yet even as the gods withdrew into mythology, their influence persisted in unexpected ways. The mathematical systems they supposedly taught still governed calculation. The astronomical observations they allegedly initiated still structured calendars. The legal principles they had decreed still shaped justice systems. The irrigation techniques, the metallurgy, the writing itself, all continued, their origins attributed to divine teaching even as belief in those teachers faded. Perhaps that is the truest form of legacy. Not presence, but pattern. Not worship, but practice. The techniques and systems that outlived the teachers who transmitted them. By the time Alexander's army swept through Mesopotamia in 331 BCE, the great temples stood but felt increasingly like museums of previous ages. The rituals continued, performed by priests who maintained traditions older than memory. But the vitality had drained away. The gods no longer spoke. The prayers no longer received responses that anyone could detect. Babylon itself, once the cosmic navel, the point where heaven touched earth, had become simply another conquered city. Its theological significance irrelevant to Greek conquerors who brought their own gods, their own stories, their own understanding of divine human relationship. The Anunnaki had completed their withdrawal, leaving behind only the tablets that recorded their presence, the ruins of temples built for their dwelling, and the cultural inheritance of a civilization they had allegedly founded. Whether they had been gods who chose distance, extraterrestrial visitors who departed, or simply the way ancient humans conceptualized the transmission of knowledge, their story ended not with dramatic departure, but with gradual fade, presence becoming memory, memory becoming myth, myth becoming academic interest. The legacy endures not in belief, but in influence. Every civilization touched by Mesopotamian culture carries traces of Anunnaki theology, even when the names are forgotten. The concept of divine council appears in Judaism and Christianity. The association of gods with planets persists through astrology. The legal codes echo Mesopotamian principles. The flood story repeats in every tradition that descended from or contacted the cultures of the Tigris and Euphrates. In the museum cases where the tablets now rest, the cuneiform still records the names Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Inanna. The wedge-shaped characters preserve syllables that once held power to bind oaths, legitimate kings, explain existence. They record a relationship between humanity and divinity that was immediate, complicated, productive, and ultimately unsustainable in its intimacy. The gods who walked among humans either withdrew or were conceptualized differently as culture evolved beyond need for their presence. What remains is the question of what that presence meant and whether its ending represents loss or maturation. The Anunnaki's withdrawal allowed humanity to develop its own authority, its own relationship to cosmic order without requiring divine intermediation. But it also created the distance that enables doubt, the space where faith becomes necessary because direct knowledge is no longer available. The tablets record the transition from knowing to believing, from presence to absence, from a world where gods answered to a world where they are silent, waiting to see if we remember what they taught before the fading began. When George Smith deciphered the Flood tablet in 1872, standing in the British Museum surrounded by fragments of clay that had waited 3,000 years to speak again, he reportedly began removing his clothes in excitement. The Victorian audience watching his presentation stirred with discomfort and fascination in equal measure. Here was a flood narrative that predated the Bible by over a millennium, a story of divine decision and human survival carved into clay when Moses was still unimaginable, when Abraham had not yet left Ur. The Anunnaki, silent for 2,000 years, began to speak again, and what they said, or what we heard in their words, depends entirely on who is listening. The rediscovery of cuneiform in the 19th century ranks among archaeology's most consequential achievements. Henry Rawlinson dangling from cliffs in Persia, copying the Behistun inscription. Jules Oppert decoding the syllabary. George Smith finding Gilgamesh among the rubble of Nineveh's library. Each breakthrough revealed more of the civilization that had preceded all others, the culture that invented writing, and with it, the possibility of preserved memory across millennia. The tablets emerged from tells, from ancient garbage heaps, from temple foundations, carrying stories that rewrote human history's beginning. Among those stories, the Anunnaki occupied central space, not peripheral deities or minor spirits, but the foundational gods who created humanity, established civilization, judged and preserved, and withdrew. Early scholars approached these texts with the tools of comparative mythology, seeing in the Mesopotamian pantheon echoes of universal human attempts to personify natural forces and explain existence. The Anunnaki were storm and sun and moon, fertility and death and rebirth, given names and personalities, because humans need stories more than abstractions. This interpretation satisfied the academic requirement for naturalistic explanation. Every culture creates gods. The Mesopotamians simply did it earlier and wrote it down, preserving what others transmitted only through oral tradition. The sophistication of their theology reflected the sophistication of their civilization, the bureaucratic complexity of their pantheon mirroring the administrative complexity of their city-states. Anu, Enlil, Enki were not beings who had walked among humans, but symbolic representations of sky, air, water, the fundamental elements that made life possible. The anthropological approach explained the Anunnaki as projection, human psychology creating divine personalities to manage the anxiety of existence in an unpredictable world. When drought came, it was Enlil's anger. When floods receded, It was Enki's mercy. The gods gave humans someone to petition, to blame, to thank. They transformed chaos into relationship, made the impersonal forces of nature personal enough to negotiate with through prayer and sacrifice. This framework allowed scholars to study Mesopotamian religion as a window into human consciousness, the universal need to see ourselves reflected in the cosmos. For most of the 20th century, this consensus held. The Anunnaki were mythology, fascinating and foundational, but no more literally real than Zeus or Odin. The tablets documented how one culture understood divine authority and the human purpose, valuable for reconstructing ancient belief systems, but irrelevant to questions of actual divine human contact. Sumerologists translated texts, traced theological evolution, mapped pantheon relationships, analyzed ritual practices, all within the comfortable assumption that they were studying how humans imagined gods, not how gods had actually behaved. Then in 1976, Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet, and the conversation shifted. Sitchin, trained in economics and history rather than Assyriology, approached the tablets with different assumptions. He read them not as mythology requiring symbolic interpretation, but as historical documentation requiring literal translation. The Anunnaki were not gods in the supernatural sense, but extraterrestrial beings, visitors from another planet in our solar system, a world Sitchin identified with the Sumerian Nibiru, whose orbit brought it through the inner solar system every 3,600 years. These beings came to Earth seeking gold, necessary for some purpose on their homeworld. They genetically engineered humans by combining their DNA with that of existing hominids, creating workers capable of mining and processing the gold they required. Every element of Sumerian mythology became, in Sitchin's framework, misunderstood history. The creation of humans from clay and divine blood described genetic engineering using Earth-based biology and extraterrestrial genetics. The flood was not divine punishment, but the natural consequence of Nibiru's passage, disturbing Earth's climate. The gods' departure was literal return to their homeworld, their periodic returns throughout history corresponding to Nibiru's orbital period. The sophisticated knowledge that appeared suddenly in Sumer came from technological transfer, advanced beings teaching primitive humans astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, metallurgy. Sitchin supported his interpretation with linguistic analysis, claiming that proper translation of Sumerian and Akkadian terms revealed technological concepts hidden beneath theological language. The word for God, he argued, literally meant those who from heaven to earth came. References to divine boats were spacecraft. Descriptions of creation contained biological terminology. The tablets were not religious texts, but scientific reports, written in the only language available to ancient scribes who witnessed technology they could not otherwise describe. The academic response was immediate and dismissive. Sumerologists pointed out fundamental errors in Sitchin's translations, misunderstandings of grammar, selective reading of ambiguous terms, imposition of modern concepts onto ancient language. The word he translated as spacecraft simply meant divine boat, a ritual object. The creation accounts used standard mythological language found in cultures worldwide. The astronomical claims were either wrong or based on misidentification of symbols. Nibiru in actual Mesopotamian texts referred to Jupiter or a crossing point in the heavens, not a 12th planet with elliptical orbit. Michael Heiser, a scholar of ancient Near Eastern languages, systematically dismantled Sitchin's linguistic claims, demonstrating that the translations did not support the interpretations built upon them. Other academics noted that Sitchin's theory required ignoring contradictory evidence, cherry-picking supportive fragments while dismissing the larger context that framed those fragments within clear mythological structure. The ancient astronaut hypothesis violated Occam's razor, proposing complex explanations involving extraterrestrial intervention when simpler explanations involving human cultural development sufficed. Yet Sitchin's books became bestsellers. They spawned entire subgenres of alternative archaeology, ancient astronaut theory, television shows that continue airing decades later. Ancient Aliens treats the Anunnaki as established fact, interpreting every ancient monument, every advanced astronomical knowledge, every sudden appearance of civilization as evidence of extraterrestrial teaching. The popular imagination embraced what academia rejected. Why? Perhaps because Sitchin's interpretation offered something the academic consensus could not: significance. In the scholarly framework, the Anunnaki are interesting but dead, ancient people's way of understanding their world, valuable for historical knowledge, but irrelevant to contemporary existence. In Sitchin's framework, they are real, their return predicted, their genetic engineering still affecting us, their presence throughout history explaining mysteries that conventional archaeology struggles with. The Anunnaki become not past but prologue, not mythology but suppressed history. The psychological appeal is obvious. Humans want to matter cosmically, not just historically. We want our origins to be special, our creation to involve intelligence rather than accident, our relationship to the universe to be more than isolation on a random planet. The ancient astronaut theory provides this significance. We are not alone. We never were. The gods were real, their return possible, our existence part of a larger cosmic drama that continues. There is also the appeal of hidden knowledge, of seeing what others miss. Academic consensus can feel like gatekeeping, scholars protecting territory by dismissing alternatives. To believe the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors is to join a community that values independent thinking over institutional authority, that trusts ancient texts over modern interpretation, that sees through the academic establishment's limitations. Whether justified or not, this stance attracts those who distrust official narratives in any domain. The debate has produced strange alliances and stranger antagonisms. Some religious fundamentalists embrace ancient astronaut theory as confirmation that Genesis describes literal genetic engineering, though usually they replace Sitchin's extraterrestrials with fallen angels, spiritual beings rather than physical aliens. Other religious groups condemn the theory as demonic deception designed to replace faith with false science. Mainstream academics generally ignore the entire conversation, considering it beneath serious response, while alternative researchers accuse them of closed-minded dogmatism. Lost in the polarization is any nuanced middle ground. Perhaps the tablets contain layers of meaning that neither literal reading nor purely symbolic interpretation fully captures. Perhaps the Anunnaki represent human memory of something real, but not what either academics or alternative theorists imagine. Perhaps the knowledge transmission happened, but not through extraterrestrial contact, through human means we no longer fully understand. Through cultural processes that left mythological residue we cannot cleanly decode. The Anunnaki's modern presence extends beyond books and television into video games, where they appear as ancient AI or alien overseers, into novels where they return to reclaim Earth, into conspiracy theories where they still secretly control human affairs through bloodline descendants, into New Age spirituality, where they become ascended masters offering channeled wisdom. Each interpretation serves different needs, answers different questions, provides different meanings to seekers who find something valuable in these ancient names. What all these modern engagements share is the recognition that the Anunnaki story touches something persistent in human consciousness. Whether as gods or aliens or symbols or memories, they represent the question of origin, of purpose, of whether we are created or accidental, guided or abandoned, significant or alone. The tablets force us to confront these questions because they are the oldest written attempt to answer them, preserved in clay that has outlasted every empire that tried to bury or burn or forget what they said. The mystery endures because it cannot be definitively resolved. The evidence is too fragmentary, too open to interpretation, too dependent on assumptions about what is possible. If you begin with the premise that gods are metaphor, the tablets describe mythology. If you begin with the premise that extraterrestrial contact is possible, the same tablets describe documentation of that contact. If you begin with the premise that human consciousness can access collective memory, or that some transmission of knowledge occurred through means we do not understand, the tablets accommodate that framework too. Perhaps the Anunnaki's greatest trick is their refusal to be pinned down. They exist in the space between certainty and speculation, between past and present, between what we know and what we wonder. Every generation rediscovers them and interprets them according to contemporary concerns. The Victorians saw them through the lens of empire and biblical criticism. The 20th century saw them through the lens of space-age possibility. The 21st century sees them through the lens of simulation theory, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering. The tablets remain constant. The questions we bring to them evolve. Standing before those tablets in museum cases, looking at cuneiform pressed into clay by hands that died 5,000 years ago, one cannot help but feel the weight of transmission. Someone thought this mattered enough to record. Someone preserved it carefully enough that we can read it now. Whether the Anunnaki were gods or visitors or brilliant metaphors or garbled memories, someone was trying to tell us something about where we came from and what we were made for. The message arrived. We simply cannot agree on how to read it. That disagreement itself might be valuable. It keeps us asking questions that matter. It prevents the past from becoming settled and therefore ignorable. It reminds us that certainty is often premature, that knowledge evolves, that today's fringe theory occasionally becomes tomorrow's accepted framework. The Anunnaki refuse to let us be comfortable with easy answers about human origins or human purpose. They sit in the tablets like riddles, daring each generation to solve them, knowing the solution will reflect who we are as much as who they were. The clay tablets sit in museums now, behind glass, numbered and catalogued, their cuneiform pressed into earth 5,000 years ago, preserved by fires that destroyed the libraries that held them, transmitted through accidents of history that allowed fragments to survive when everything else crumbled into sand. The Anunnaki are silent within those tablets, neither confirming nor denying the questions we bring to them, neither revealing nor concealing what they were or what they represent. They simply wait, patient as the earth from which they came, holding names that once commanded sacrifice, and now command only attention, only wonder, only the eternal human willingness to ask where consciousness comes from, and whether we are alone in asking. Perhaps that silence is the truest answer they can give, not because they withhold truth, but because the truth they carry exceeds the kind of knowing we demand from other subjects. The Anunnaki exist in the space between certainty and mystery, between what we remember and what we have forgotten, between gods who walked and the human need to imagine gods walking. They are real in the way all foundational questions are real, not as facts that can be proven or disproven, but as orientations toward existence itself, as postures consciousness takes when it looks back toward its own beginning and finds only traces, only suggestions, only these wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay 5,000 years ago. We have asked who they were. We have pursued the question through creation myths and flood narratives, through king lists and astronomical tablets, through academic frameworks and alternative theories. We have demanded the clay choose between history and mythology, between literal truth and symbolic meaning. And the clay has done what earth always does, held what was pressed into it without, defending, accommodated every interpretation without choosing, waited with patience that exceeds all our certainties and will outlast all our conclusions. Maybe the Anunnaki were gods who walked among the first cities, teaching civilization, establishing order, then withdrawing when their work was complete, or when humanity grew too loud, or simply when the age that allowed such intimacy between divine and mortal came to its natural end. Maybe they were humans imagining gods, because imagination was the only tool available for processing the sudden sophistication they found themselves possessing, the knowledge that seemed to arrive fully formed, the capabilities that appeared without the slow accumulation history usually requires. Maybe they were visitors from elsewhere, beings whose presence left traces in myth, because myth was the only language ancient peoples had for describing what exceeded their understanding. Or maybe they were all of these simultaneously, real presences and symbolic frameworks, experience and interpretation, woven so tightly that separating them falsifies both. Maybe they were what they have always been, the names we give to the mystery of becoming, to the inexplicable emergence of consciousness from matter, to the strange fact that awareness arose at all in a universe that seems perfectly capable of complexity without anyone being aware of it. The question deepens the more we learn. Knowledge does not resolve it. Technology does not answer it. We are no closer to understanding why consciousness exists than the Sumerians were when they pressed these names into clay. And perhaps we never will be, because the question asks us to use awareness, to explain awareness, to employ the very thing that requires explaining as the tool for explanation. The Anunnaki teach us to live with this paradox, to sit with mystery without demanding it transform into certainty, to wonder without requiring resolution. They represent not information about ancient gods, but instruction about the posture consciousness takes when it confronts what exceeds its comprehension, when it stands before questions too large for answers, too deep for the kind of knowing we apply to simpler matters. In refusing to be pinned down, they force us to remain in the space of not knowing, and that space, uncomfortable as it is, might be where wisdom actually lives. Every civilization returns to the same foundational questions because consciousness generates these questions inevitably as part of its nature, as the cost and gift of being aware at all. The Sumerians asked in the language of clay and divine blood. We ask in the language of neurons and evolution. Future ages will ask with vocabularies we cannot imagine. The words change, the wonder remains. And the Anunnaki, oldest written version of this wondering, connect all ages through their persistence, through their refusal to fade, through their insistence that the question matters even when, especially when, answers remain forever beyond reach. The names endure: Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Inanna. Syllables that carried power for 3,000 years, fell silent for 2,000 more, then woke again when cuneiform was deciphered and scholars found the gods waiting in clay, patient as earth itself. They are not dead. They are not alive. They occupy that strange space between, existing now primarily as the questions we ask about them rather than answers they provide. And maybe that is the only mode of existence that survives 5 millennia. Not presence, but resonance. Not power, but pattern. Not divinity, but the human need to imagine divinity and thereby understand ourselves. We are still the mixed ones, the beings made from earth and something else. The tablets called us Lulu, mixed, because we bridge categories that should not connect, because we are matter that thinks and thereby exceeds matter while remaining bound to it. That fundamental strangeness has not changed across 5,000 years. We remain hybrids, neither wholly physical nor wholly anything else, caught between the earth that formed us and the questions that lift us momentarily beyond it, between the clay we are made from and the wondering that makes us more than clay. The Anunnaki, then, are not separate from us. They are the part of us that remembers or imagines having been more, the part that senses we carry within us capacities we have not yet learned to access, the part that refuses to accept existence without interrogating its meaning, whether they literally walked among humans or whether we created them to make sense of our own sudden awakening. They represent the eternal human orientation toward mystery, the recognition that we come from somewhere we cannot fully remember, that we inherit something we did not create, that consciousness itself is gift or accident or both, and either way requires acknowledgement, requires wonder, requires humility. Museum cases hold the tablets. The clay rests as it has rested through empires and languages and the death of every person who originally read it. The cuneiform does not fade. The wedges maintain their shapes. And in that permanence lies a kind of hope, the recognition that some things outlast certainty, some questions outlast answers, some mysteries outlast every attempt to reduce them to simple explanations. The Anunnaki survive not because we have proven they existed, or because we have demonstrated they did not, but because the question they represent cannot die as long as consciousness continues, as long as awareness wonders about its own origin, as long as clay survives to carry the names forward. 5,000 years they have endured. How many more will they persist? Longer than our civilization, perhaps. Longer than our languages. Longer than our certainties about what is real and what is imagined. The clay will outlast us as it outlasted Sumer, holding what was pressed into it, waiting for the next consciousness to find it and wonder as we have wondered, to ask as we have asked, to stand before the same mystery and recognize in it their own uncertainty, their own longing, their own need to know where they came from, even when knowing remains impossible. Perhaps the Anunnaki were never meant to be found, only remembered. Perhaps what we call gods is only consciousness reaching across time toward its own origin, asking the same questions in different languages, seeking the same answers that always recede just beyond certainty's reach. And perhaps that reaching, that wonder, that endless questioning carved into clay and carried through 5,000 years is more real than any answer we could extract from the silence. For the tablets do not lie, but they do not explain. They record without commentary. They preserve without interpretation. They wait, patient as the earth that formed them, as the dust that will reclaim us, as the silence that preceded consciousness and will survive it. The clay remembers what we have forgotten and what we never knew. It holds syllables that once bridged heaven and earth when both were closer than they are now, when the Anunnaki, whatever they were, walked among those who would become their rememberers, their interpreters, their inheritors of questions without end. And if we listen closely, in the space between certainty and doubt, in the pause between knowing and wondering, we might hear it still. Not voices, not answers, but something older than language, deeper than speech, the pulse of mystery itself, the eternal invitation to wonder without resolution, the recognition that we are part of a story longer than our lives, deeper than our knowing, older than our memory. The tablets rest in darkness. The names persist in silence. And we, brief inheritors of breath and clay, stand between what was written when the world was young and what we are still learning to read. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the Anunnaki were never meant to be solved, only engaged, only wondered about, only allowed to question us even as we question them. What do we believe about creation, about consciousness, about our place in the cosmos that birthed us? The clay asks these questions without providing answers. And in that silence, it becomes a mirror, showing us our own assumptions, our own hopes, our own fears about what it means to be aware and mortal and searching for significance in a universe that keeps its deepest secrets hidden. The Anunnaki live in that mirror, in the space between question and answer, in the eternal human posture toward mystery that refuses to fade as long as consciousness continues, as long as wonder survives, as long as someone stands before clay pressed 5,000 years ago and asks the same question that has never stopped being asked. Where did we come from? And what made us? And are we alone? The names endure, the clay remembers, and the question, ancient as writing itself, eternal as consciousness, continues in every breath we take, in every wonder we feel, in every moment when we pause and recognize that being aware is strange and miraculous, and we may never understand why, but the mystery itself, properly held, is wisdom enough. There are moments, brief and weightless, when standing before the tablets in their museum cases, the 5,000 years between pressing and reading seem to collapse. The distance dissolves. The cuneiform stops being artifact and becomes presence, as though the hands that held reeds and chose these specific words to preserve reach forward through time and touch, however imperfectly, the hands that now excavate and translate and wonder. Someone made these marks. Someone believed they mattered. Someone hoped that others far in the future would stand as we stand now and read and remember what they could not bear to let die with their bodies. We are those others. We came. We are reading. The Anunnaki were gods, the tablets tell us, or visitors, or symbols, or memories, or something that exceeds all our categories and resists every framework we bring to understanding them. They created humanity from necessity, taught civilization from wisdom or strategy, withdrew into distance from exhaustion or design, or the natural progression of ages. Every interpretation finds support in the clay, because the clay, unlike us, does not need to choose. It holds contradictions without anxiety. It accommodates multiple truths simultaneously. Perhaps that is what makes it wiser than all the civilizations that used it. What if we have been asking the wrong question all along? Not who were the Anunnaki, but what does it mean that we still ask? Not whether they were real, but what reality they possess in human consciousness that transcends any question of historicity. They have existed for 5,000 years, not physically, perhaps not even originally, but as question, as wonder, as the names we give to the mystery of our own becoming. That existence is real regardless of whether gods walked or humans imagined gods walking. The clay sits behind glass, patient as it has always been. It does not defend itself against skepticism or assert itself against doubt. It simply is, holding what was pressed into it, allowing each generation to bring its questions and find in the wedges space for answers that contradict each other, because contradiction, perhaps, is how consciousness processes what exceeds its ability to comprehend fully. We want simplicity. The tablets offer complexity. We demand certainty. They provide invitation to wonder. Maybe that is their greatest gift. Not information about ancient gods, but demonstration of how to hold mystery without requiring it to become fact or fiction. How to sit with uncertainty without rushing to resolution. How to wonder with the kind of humility that comes from recognizing some questions may remain questions, not because we lack sufficient evidence, but because mystery is their nature, their purpose, their way of teaching us what knowledge alone cannot. The names persist because we speak them. Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Inanna. Syllables that once commanded ritual now command only attention, their power transformed but not diminished by the passage from worship to study, from invocation to inquiry, from certainty to speculation. They cannot be forgotten as long as the clay survives, and the clay, baked hard by ancient fires or by the burning of libraries that held them, survives with patience older than empires, outlasting bronze and iron and every material humanity believed was permanent. We are still the mixed ones, the Lulu, beings made from earth and something else, whether that something else is divine blood or evolutionary emergence, or the breath of consciousness arising from matter organized in impossible patterns. We bridge categories as the tablets describe. We are clay that wonders about its own formation. We are earth that questions the hands that shaped it. We are matter that thinks and thereby transcends matter while remaining bound to it, caught between the ground that formed us and the questions that lift us momentarily beyond it. Perhaps the Anunnaki were never beings at all, but the principle of consciousness wondering about its own origin, the eternal pattern of awareness reaching back toward its source and finding only traces, only suggestions, only fragments that whisper the same question we ask. Where did awareness come from? And what does it mean to possess it? And are we alone in the asking? Every civilization generates this question inevitably, as fire generates light, as consciousness generates wonder about consciousness. The Mesopotamians gave it names and pressed those names into clay. We give it other names, press it into other materials. The vocabulary changes, the wonder remains. 5,000 years the tablets have survived. How many more will they endure? Longer than any digital storage we have invented, longer than any book will last, longer perhaps than our civilization itself. They will outlast our certainties, our technologies, our frameworks for understanding what they say. They will wait for the next consciousness to excavate them, to read them, to wonder as we wonder about beings who claim to make us and what that making means and whether memory itself might be older than individual lives. The desert holds fragments still, buried beneath sand and cities, and the endless layers of time. Each new discovery adds pieces to a picture that never completes, that grows more complex rather than simpler, that deepens mystery rather than resolving it. And maybe that is appropriate. Maybe complete knowledge would rob the story of its power, would transform living mystery into settled history, into something we could file away as understood and thereby finished with. The Anunnaki refuse to be finished with. They insist on remaining question, on inhabiting the space between certainty and speculation, on forcing each generation to decide what it believes about origin and purpose and the relationship between consciousness and whatever preceded or enabled it. That insistence keeps us honest. It prevents us from settling into comfortable answers that explain nothing while seeming to explain everything. It demands we acknowledge the limits of our knowing without abandoning the value of our wondering. In the end, perhaps, we do not find the Anunnaki. They find us. Every generation that turns its attention to these ancient names, that wrestles with these ancient texts, that allows itself to wonder about gods or visitors or symbols or memories, is found by something larger than curiosity, is touched by the long human chain of consciousness, reaching across time, connecting the first ones who asked to the last ones who will ask, if consciousness survives to ask at all. The clay holds what was pressed into it, wedge-shaped marks forming syllables, forming sentences, forming stories that we read as mythology or history or documentation or metaphor, or all of these simultaneously, because the deepest truths often exceed single categories, resist simple classification, require holding multiple possibilities in mind without rushing to choose one over the others. The Anunnaki are mythology and might be history. They are symbols and might be memory. They are human imagination and might be human remembering. The tablets accommodate all these readings because truth at this depth refuses the either-or logic we apply to simpler questions. Perhaps what we call gods is only consciousness, reaching across time toward its own origin. Perhaps what we call creation is only the story consciousness tells about its own awakening. Perhaps what we call the Anunnaki is only the oldest recorded version of a question that has no answer but infinite value in the asking. Where did we come from? And what made us capable of asking? And whether anything waits in the silence to respond when we speak the ancient names into darkness. The tablets rest behind their glass. The cuneiform holds its shapes. The names endure in clay that outlasts memory, outlasts empire, outlasts every certainty we construct about what they mean. Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Inanna, those who came from heaven to earth, those who made us from their essence and our dust, those who walked among the first cities and withdrew into distance, leaving only their names pressed into earth, only their stories carved into clay, only their questions transmitted through 5,000 years of human wandering. Not gods, perhaps, and perhaps not visitors from distant worlds, but something real nonetheless, something that breathes in the space between memory and forgetting, between question and answer, between the clay that holds their names and the breath that speaks them still. The Anunnaki are not lost. They are waiting, patient as earth, persistent as wonder, eternal as the questions themselves. And if one night you stand before the tablets and listen closely, past the hum of climate control and the distant footsteps of guards, past the noise of the modern world that thinks it has outgrown mystery, you might hear it. Not voices, not words, but something older than language, deeper than speech. The pulse of consciousness wondering about its own origin, the eternal human question carved into clay and carried through time, asking still, always asking, what it means to be aware and uncertain and searching for significance in a cosmos that keeps its deepest secrets silent. The clay remembers what we have forgotten and what we never knew. It waits with patience older than knowing, holding syllables that once held power and now hold only invitation, the invitation to wonder without resolution, to question without certainty, to stand before mystery and acknowledge it as mystery rather than pretending we have solved what remains perhaps forever beyond our solving. The names endure, the clay persists, and we, brief inheritors of breath and dust, carry forward what was pressed into earth when writing was new. Not answers, but the courage to ask. Not certainty, but the willingness to wonder. Not the end of mystery, but its eternal continuation. The question passed from consciousness to consciousness, like a torch through darkness, asking always, asking still, what it means to be the mixed ones, the beings made from earth and something else, the clay that wonders about its own formation and cannot stop wondering, no matter how many millennia pass between the pressing and the reading. The tablets rest, the silence holds, and the question, ancient as consciousness itself, continues. Dawn comes slowly to the desert where Mesopotamia once breathed. Light spreads across sand that was marsh, across tells that were temples, across silence that was once the noise Enlil found unbearable. The wind moves through ruins no one visits, through cities buried beneath highways and oil fields, through earth that holds tablets still, unexcavated, waiting for hands that may never come or may come tomorrow, carrying with them the same questions we carry, the same wonder about where consciousness came from and whether the gods who claim to make us were real or necessary fictions or something our categories cannot quite capture. The Anunnaki sit within that earth, pressed into clay by reeds held by hands that returned to dust 5,000 years ago. They are neither present nor absent, neither confirmed nor denied, neither solved nor unsolvable. They simply are, existing in the space between what we know and what we wonder, between memory and forgetting, between the question we ask and the silence that answers with its own question. What does it mean that you still ask? We have traveled through their story, through creation and flood, through teaching and withdrawal, through academic analysis and alternative interpretation, through every framework we possess for understanding beings who claim to bridge heaven and earth. And we arrive where we began, uncertain, wondering, standing before clay that records without explaining, that preserves without defending, that holds meaning without insisting on any particular reading. Maybe that is all we were ever going to find. Not answers, but deeper questions. Not certainty, but recognition that certainty about such matters may be impossible, and that impossibility itself teaches something about the nature of consciousness, about our relationship to our own origins, about the limits of knowing when knowledge reaches back across 5 millennia towards something that may never have been meant to be known in the way we demand to know. The tablets hold what was pressed into them. Wedge-shaped marks, forming syllables, forming words, forming sentences, forming stories that we read as mythology or history or documentation or metaphor, depending on what we carry to the reading. The clay accommodates all these interpretations because clay, unlike us, does not need to choose. It can hold contradictions without resolving them. It can be multiple things simultaneously without anxiety about consistency. Perhaps that is what makes it wiser than the civilizations that used it. We are the mixed ones, Lulu, beings made from earth and something else. The Sumerians said divine blood. We say evolutionary emergence. Different vocabularies for the same mystery. Matter organized in patterns too complex for matter alone. Consciousness arising from clay. Awareness looking back at its own formation and finding only fragments, only suggestions, only these ancient names that whisper without speaking clearly. Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Inanna. The names persist not because they are true or false, but because they carried meaning once and might carry meaning again. Because they represent humanity's first written attempt to answer questions that have no expiration date. Because they preserve the posture of wonder itself, the willingness to ask without requiring resolution, the courage to record uncertainty so that others might inherit it and ask in their own way. Every civilization builds its monuments to permanence, and every civilization returns to dust. The ziggurats crumbled, the temples fell, the empires that believed themselves eternal dissolved into archaeology, but the clay survived, not because it was stronger than bronze or more valuable than gold, but because it was humble, because it asked nothing for itself, because it simply held what was pressed into it and waited with patience that exceeds all human timescales. What the Anunnaki were may matter less than what they represent, the eternal human posture toward mystery, the recognition that we come from somewhere we cannot fully remember, that we carry within us something we did not create, that existence itself is gift or accident or both, and either way requires acknowledgement, requires wonder, requires the kind of humility that comes from accepting. We may never know with certainty where consciousness comes from or what it means to possess it. The museum cases hold the tablets behind glass. The clay rests as it has rested for decades or centuries in collections, as it rested for millennia beneath sand, as it rested in scribal schools when the ink was still fresh and the name still held power to bind oaths and legitimate kings. The cuneiform does not fade. The wedges maintain their shapes. Time moves around them, but not through them. They are more permanent than memory, more durable than faith, more patient than any institution humanity has built to preserve what matters. And what matters, perhaps, is not the specific answer to who the Anunnaki were, but the recognition that the question itself connects us across impossible distance to others who asked, to consciousness reaching through time to touch other consciousness, to the long, unbroken chain of wondering that began when awareness first woke enough to ask why it woke and what woke it, and whether anything waits in the darkness to answer when we call the names into silence. The desert holds its secrets still. Beneath the sand, beneath the cities, beneath everything we have built on top of what came before, tablets wait. Some will surface, most will not. The complete archive of Mesopotamian thought and myth and documentation will never be recovered. Too much has been lost to time, to flood, to war, to the simple entropy that claims all things eventually. What survives is fragment. What we build from fragments is interpretation. And interpretation, however careful, however scholarly, however sincere, reflects the interpreter as much as the interpreted. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the Anunnaki were always meant to be mirrors, showing each age its own assumptions, its own hopes, its own fears dressed in ancient costume. We see in them what we need to see, what we are capable of seeing, what our frameworks allow us to perceive, and that seeing, partial and provisional as it must be, is still valuable. It is still connection. It is still consciousness, engaging with consciousness across time and finding in that engagement something that feels like homecoming, like recognition, like remembering what we never quite forgot. The clay remembers what we have forgotten and what we never knew. It holds syllables that once commanded sacrifice and now command only attention. It carries names that ruled the night sky and morning prayers that walked among humans and withdrew into distance, that made us from their essence and our earth. Or so the stories tell, or so we choose to remember. Or so consciousness describes its own awakening when it looks back toward the beginning and finds only these wedges, only these fragments, only this invitation to wonder without end. Who were the Anunnaki? Gods or visitors or symbols or memories or all of these or none of these or something our categories cannot reach? The question echoes through 5,000 years and will echo through 5,000 more if consciousness survives to ask it. And maybe that echo is the answer. Maybe the Anunnaki live in the asking itself, in the refusal to let mystery settle into simple explanation, in the human need to question origin and purpose and meaning even when questions lead only to deeper questions, to mysteries that deepen rather than resolve. The sun climbs higher, the sand grows warm. Somewhere a scholar bends over a tablet, translating, interpreting, adding another layer to the long conversation about what these ancient texts mean and whether they point toward truth or merely toward the human need for truth. Somewhere, a seeker reads about the Anunnaki and feels something stir, some recognition or longing or sense that the story matters even if its literal truth remains forever uncertain. Somewhere, consciousness wonders about its own origin, asking the same questions in new words, carrying forward what was pressed into clay when writing was new and the gods, perhaps, still walked. The tablets rest, the names endure, and we, brief inheritors of breath and earth, stand between what was written and what will be written, between the past that shaped us and the future we're shaping, between the clay that holds their names and the silence that follows when we speak them. Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Inanna, those who came from heaven to earth, or those we imagined coming, or those we remember through the mist of time and distance and the slow transformation of presence into myth. They are with us still, not as certainty, but as question, not as answer, but as the eternal invitation to wonder, not as knowledge, but as the recognition that some mysteries remain mysterious, not because we lack the tools to solve them, but because mystery is their gift, their teaching, their way of keeping us humble and curious and human. The clay holds its silence. The wedges remain clear. And in that clarity and that silence, the Anunnaki wait as they have always waited, neither insisting nor withdrawing, neither revealing nor concealing, simply being what they are. The oldest written question about where consciousness comes from, preserved in earth, transmitted through time, asking still, always asking, what it means to be aware and mortal, and searching for meaning in a cosmos that breathes its secrets slowly, in rhythms longer than civilizations, in cycles that return and return and return, like the desert wind across ruins, like the light across clay, like consciousness across the eternal mystery of its own becoming. The clay remembers, even when we forget, even when we remember wrong, even when we stand before it and know we'll never know for certain, but choose to wonder anyway, choose to preserve that wonder for others who will come after, choose to press our own questions into our own materials, and hope, as the Sumerians hoped, that someone will read and recognize in our asking their own asking, in our uncertainty their own uncertainty, in our wonder the wonder that connects all consciousness across all time. The tablets rest in darkness, the names endure in silence, and the question, ancient as writing itself, continues.